The restaurant was the kind of place where every detail was carefully curated to whisper of power. Dark wood walls gleamed under the muted glow of brass sconces, jazz murmured from a corner speaker, and the air carried the faint scent of leather and aged whiskey. Waiters moved with quiet precision, their crisp uniforms blending into the background of murmured conversations and clinking glassware. Deals were struck here with handshakes that cost fortunes. Contracts discussed over steaks that cost rent. Richard Blake sat alone at a corner table, his posture immaculate, his tailored suit a dark mirror of the room's formality. He was a man who built empires out of order precision meetings, flawless reports, schedules that ran to the second. Control was his oxygen. Yet tonight, as he stared down at the stack of documents sprawled across the linen-draped table, his chest felt tight, his breath uneven. The neat columns of text, all in Spanish, blurred into something impenetrable. Legal jargon laced with technical clauses, each line holding the weight of millions. His glass of whiskey sat untouched, amber catching the light. His dinner grilled salmon and asparagus, perfectly plated, had cooled into an afterthought. He pressed his fingers to his temples and tried again, forcing himself to scan the words, searching for fragments of meaning he might recall from long-forgotten college classes. Nothing. His memory betrayed him. His confidence faltered. Each paragraph was a wall he couldn't climb. The acquisition had been months in the making. A chance to absorb one of Spain's fastest-growing logistics firms into his empire. His board was restless. His legal team impatient. His phone had buzzed 3 times in the last 10 minutes. Each message a polite but urgent variation of the same demand. Update. Status. When will the documents be signed? And his translator, the one person he trusted to guide him through this labyrinth, had simply vanished. Hours ago, without explanation, without warning. A silent betrayal that left him floundering in a sea of foreign words. He had tried calling, emailing, messaging, nothing. Radio silence. Richard's jaw tightened as he leaned back in his chair. His reflection stared back at him from the restaurant's polished mirror. Dark hair streaked with early silver. Sharp lines around his mouth from years of control and discipline. He looked every bit the part of a man who had conquered markets and boardrooms. But beneath the surface, he felt the crack forming. Tonight, control was slipping through his fingers. The room hummed around him, laughter from a nearby table, the delicate clink of cutlery, the soft rise of a saxophone, but it all faded into a suffocating silence in his head. He could hear only the ticking of the unseen clock, each second a reminder that his empire might crumble on the fine print of a contract. He couldn't read. He exhaled slowly, reaching for his phone to craft some vague excuse for the lawyers circling like hawks, when a small voice broke through the noise. "Excuse me, sir. Can I eat what you're not finishing?" Richard froze, his hand hovering above the glowing screen. He turned, startled. Standing beside his table was a little girl barefoot, no more than 7, with blonde braids and a red t-shirt faded almost to pink. Her denim skirt was frayed, her big blue eyes steady but hollowed by hunger. For the first time that night, the documents blurred from his mind. He blinked, caught between disbelief and confusion. In a room where $1 million deals were inked between courses, a barefoot child was asking for the scraps on his plate. Asterisk, the question hung in the air like a crack in the polished surface of Richard Blake's world. "Excuse me, sir. Can I eat what you're not finishing?" For a moment, he thought he'd imagined it. The restaurant was too refined, too tightly controlled for such words to belong here. Yet there she stood, a child, a barefoot girl, no more than 7, her braids loose and uneven, her t-shirt faded to a tired red. The denim skirt clinging to her thin frame was frayed at the hem, threads dangling like cobwebs. Her small feet pressed against the marble floor, pale and smudged with city grime, utterly out of place amid polished shoes and $1,000 heels. Richard blinked, his throat dry. He half expected a waiter to swoop in, a parent to follow, some logical explanation for why a child like this was intruding on the sanctum of deals and discretion. But the room carried on without pause. No one turned. No one whispered. It was as if she were invisible to everyone except him. "You want my leftovers?" His voice was quieter than he intended, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile strangeness of the moment. The girl nodded, solemn and steady. "I'm hungry." Richard glanced down at the salmon cooling on his plate, the asparagus lined like soldiers beside it. He had hardly touched it, appetite consumed by the ink-snarled maze of contracts. But still, this was Midtown Manhattan, not a back alley. The incongruity made his pulse tick faster. "Where are your parents?" he asked, scanning the room again, searching for a frantic face, someone rushing toward them. Nothing. Waiters glided by as if she weren't there. A group of executives at the bar laughed loudly at something meaningless. The world refused to acknowledge the small intruder. She didn't answer his question. Instead, she looked at his untouched food again, her expression unchanged. That calm unnerved him more than tears would have. He pushed the plate across the table. "Take it," he muttered. "I can't eat anyway." The girl slid into the chair opposite him, without hesitation, her thin arms reaching for the fork. But instead of digging in right away, her gaze snagged on the sea of papers scattered across the linen tablecloth. Her eyes narrowed, studying them with unnerving focus. "That's Spanish," she said softly. Almost to herself, Richard's head snapped up. "What?" She pointed with the fork, her braid slipping over her shoulder. "The papers. They're in Spanish." His breath caught. Of course they were. That was the very weight crushing him tonight. But how could a child recognize that so quickly? He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah, and it's a problem." She chewed on the inside of her cheek, then added, "I can read it if you want." The air left his lungs in a sharp exhale of disbelief. He leaned back, studying her more closely. She couldn't be older than 7. Dirt streaked her legs. Her wrists were too thin. Her voice, however, carried no hesitation, no uncertainty. "You can translate legal documents?" His tone was sharper than intended. "At your age." The girl didn't flinch. "My mom was a translator. She taught me before she got sick." The words landed with a gravity that silenced his skepticism, at least for a beat. There was something in her voice too precise, too honest to be a child's bluff. Still, his mind fought the absurdity. A barefoot child in an elite restaurant claiming she could save a multi-million-dollar deal? Impossible. And yet, Astor's curiosity or desperation overpowered him. He slid one page from the pile, pushing it toward her across the table. "Go ahead. Let's see what you've got." Her small finger traced the lines of text as she read, lips moving silently at first. Then, in a clear voice, she said, "This part here means they're charging an extra fee for international logistics storage. But it's written like it's optional. You can decline it." Richard still. He knew just enough Spanish to catch the shape of her truth. His pulse quickened, and here, she continued, tapping the page with her fingernail. "It says they'll retain partial ownership of your assets in Spain unless you reject this paragraph. You should reject it." A cold shiver ran through him. She was right. Perfectly right. Not a lucky guess, not a vague summary. A precise translation of the traps he feared were buried in those contracts. He leaned forward, forgetting the restaurant, forgetting the hum of jazz, forgetting the whispers of million-dollar deals around them. His gaze fixed on her, truly seeing her for the first time not as a hungry child asking for scraps, but as something far stranger, a ghost from nowhere, a voice out of the dark, and possibly the one person who could save him from catastrophe. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice lower now, rougher. The girl's blue eyes lifted from the paper. "Lacey. Where are your parents?" Her expression flickered, shadows passing across her small face. "My mom died last year. We used to live in a shelter. Now, I don't know." The words hollowed out the space between them. Richard felt the ground shift under him. The control he clung to so tightly slipped further, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years: raw, uncalculated uncertainty. Around them, the restaurant remained a cocoon of polished normalcy, but for Richard, the world had tilted. A barefoot girl had stepped into his empire of contracts and control, and with a few sentences, cracked it wide open. Asterisk. The valet barely looked up when Richard's car rolled to a stop in front of the glittering Midtown Tower. He was used to opening the door for Richard Blake, the CEO who never had time for idle chatter. But tonight, as the man stepped out and extended a hand to a barefoot child wrapped in his blazer, the valet's composure faltered. His brows lifted in a silent question. Richard silenced him with one hard glance, the kind that said, "Don't ask." Lacey's small hand slipped into his as though it had always belonged there. She walked cautiously, the marble steps to cold against her bare feet. The revolving glass door swallowed them, sealing them inside the quiet lobby where concierge smiled automatically before freezing. A child, ragged and thin, clung to the CEO's side like an unlikely shadow. The moment stretched, uneasy, until Richard's voice cut through. Asterisk. "Good evening." Nothing more. No explanation. The concierge dropped his eyes back to his computer, as if training himself not to have seen. The elevator ride was silent. but charged. Lacey's reflection stared back at Richard from the mirrored walls, braids slightly undone. Dirt smudged across her cheek, his tailored jacket draped like a cloak around her small shoulders. She seemed unbothered by the luxury of polished steel and soft golden light. Instead, she pressed her nose to the panel of buttons, whispering the numbers under her breath as if they were a secret code. When the door slid open, the penthouse revealed itself like a stage set for a man who had never learned to live off stage. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the sides, showcasing Manhattan's city lights like diamonds scattered across black velvet. Marble floors gleamed. The furniture was sharp-edged and modern, all glass, chrome, and leather. Every detail screamed money, but nothing whispered home. Lacey hesitated at the threshold. Her small fingers tightened around the sleeve of his blazer. The awe on her face wasn't admiration, it was disbelief. To a girl who had spent nights in shelters and streets, the silence of such vastness felt unnatural, almost threatening. Richard noticed. For the first time, he saw his empire of stone and glass through her eyes, cold, sterile. A place designed to impress shareholders, not comfort a child. He set his briefcase down, suddenly unsure of what to do with himself. "You can sit anywhere you like," he said, his voice softer than it had been in years. She stepped inside, cautious at first, then wandered to the wide couch and brushed her fingers across the glass coffee table. She perched on the edge of the leather sofa, legs tucked underneath her, small and out of place yet somehow claiming the space more naturally than he ever had. Within the hour, his assistant arrived, eyes widening at the sight of the child. But she followed orders without question, delivering bags of clothes, shoes, and boxes of food from a late-night diner. Richard took the packages, dismissed her with a nod, and set the feast out on the kitchen island. Lacey devoured the grilled cheese and tomato soup as though afraid it might vanish. Richard sat across from her, coffee cup in hand, pretending to scroll his phone while watching her carefully. The way she cupped the bowl with both hands, the way her lips curled faintly into a smile when the warmth hit her. There was no performance in her gratitude, only raw, honest relief. When she finished, he handed her a pair of pajamas, pink, soft, slightly too big but warm. She clutched them tightly as if they were treasure. "Bathrooms down the hall," he said, his tone awkward, unfamiliar. "Guest room's yours for tonight." 20 minutes later, she padded back into the hall, hair damp, pajamas hanging loose, a small stuffed bear from the shopping bag clutched to her chest. She looked impossibly young now, the weight of her earlier composure slipping away. "Thank you," she whispered. "I haven't slept in a real bed in a long time." Richard's throat tightened. Words, his usual weapons, deserted him. He managed only, "You're safe here. Get some rest." She nodded and disappeared into the guest room, closing the door gently behind her. He stood in the hallway, staring at nothing. His apartment, always silent and immaculate, now carried the faint heartbeat of another life. He should have gone to bed. He should have returned to the contract she had deciphered with a precision that unnerved him. But instead, he sat in his office, the glow of the laptop screen painting sharp angles across his face. He typed her name into databases, into private networks, into social service records. Lacey, age unknown, mother deceased, shelters scattered through the city. Then nothing. Her file thinned into shadows, as though she had slipped between the cracks of a system built to forget children like her. Each dead and only sharpened his resolve. The empire he'd built was at risk of collapse from a contract he couldn't read. And the one person who had saved him from signing away his fortune was a child who didn't even exist on paper. By the time dawn bled pale light into the city, Richard rose from his desk, exhausted but strangely alive. He walked to the guest room and opened the door just a crack. Lacey lay curled beneath the blankets, the stuffed bear pressed against her chest, her small frame rising and falling with steady breaths. In that quiet moment, Richard Blake, millionaire, CEO, master of control, realized the strangest truth of all. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. Asterisk night in Manhattan always carried a pulse, a restless hum that crept in even through glass walls. 40 stories high, Richard Blake sat in the glow of his penthouse office, the city stretching wide and endless below him. Normally, this art belonged to him alone, contracts reviewed, strategies refined, empires built in silence. But tonight, silence was no longer empty. Behind one closed door, in a guest room that had never known a guest, a child slept with a stuffed bear pressed to her chest. Richard should have been relieved. The contracts she had skimmed, contracts meant to crush him beneath hidden clauses, had been exposed. By her uncanny fluency, he should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt unsettled, restless in a way spreadsheets and signatures could not soothe. He had learned to live his life inside systems, markets, mergers, corporate ladders. But this girl, barefoot and half-starved, had appeared from nowhere and ripped a hole through all his carefully built walls. He pulled the laptop closer, typing her name again, Lacey. He added variations, Lacey, Lachi, initials. Search engines, legal databases, even private networks he paid fortunes to access. Fragments flickered on the screen, shelter records half completed, social worker notes with missing details, a hospital admission under a mother's name. Then silence. She vanished from the system like smoke. Richard leaned back, running a hand across his jaw. He had built a billion-dollar company on the premise that everything could be tracked, measured, quantified. Every shipment had a barcode, every client a contract, every asset a record. But this girl, this child, who had stepped into his life carrying knowledge that saved his empire, was barely more than a ghost in the world's official memory. Suspicion gnawed at him. Who was she really? Was it coincidence she appeared in that restaurant, in front of his contracts, offering the exact skill he needed? Or was it something else, something darker? He considered the possibility of manipulation, of rivals planning her as bait, though the thought collapsed under the weight of her eyes. There had been no performance in them, only hunger and something older than her years. Still, unease lingered. He reached for his phone, dialing a contact he trusted, a man in the private intelligence business. "I need you to run a search," Richard said, his voice low. "Name's Lacey, no last name, roughly 7 years old, last known with her mother, a translator, possibly deceased. Cross-check shelters, hospitals, immigration databases if you have to. 7. The man on the other end asked, startled, "Just do it." He ended the call before questions could follow. The clock struck 3. He rose from his chair, restless, and walked the corridor. At the guest room door, he hesitated, then opened it a crack. The sight disarmed him. Lacey curled in a nest of blankets, hair messy, lips parted in sleep. She looked impossibly small, impossibly breakable. And yet he remembered the steadiness in her voice as she had pointed to the fatal clause in his contract, a contradiction that unsettled him more than any hostile takeover ever had. Richard closed the door softly and returned to his office. He sat in the dark, staring out at the city. For the first time in years, he asked himself a question he didn't know how to answer. What am I supposed to do with her? By dawn, pale light spilled across the marble floors, chasing away the shadows. Richard hadn't slept, but his fatigue carried no weight. Instead, it hung with a strange energy, a pull he hadn't felt since his earliest days of building his company. When the first text from his assistant pinged reminders of meetings, of shareholder expectations, he silenced it with a single reply: postpone everything. He wasn't ready to face the world outside. Not yet. Not while the mystery of a barefoot girl slept in the room down the hall. Asterisk, when he finally heard movement, soft footsteps padding across polished marble, Richard left his office. Lacey stood in the kitchen doorway, hair tangled, pajamas too big for her frame. She blinked at the breakfast spread he had ordered in pancakes, eggs, fruit, a glass of orange juice, and froze as if afraid it would vanish if she touched it. "Eat," he said. Pouring himself coffee, she sat cautiously, then devoured the food in small, careful bites. Between mouthfuls, her gaze drifted across the vast apartment. "Do you live here alone?" "Yes," Richard replied. "Always?" He hesitated. "Always." Her forehead scrunched as if the answer was strange to her. She returned to the food, silent, and he watched her without speaking. The unease had not left him. If anything, it deepened with every detail she revealed. The calmness, the intelligence, the way she carried loss like a weight she had already grown accustomed to. Asterisk, later that morning, he returned to his office and found himself staring at the contracts again. Her voice echoed in his head, steady, certain, saving him from ruin with a precision no one else had offered. And for the first time in years, Richard Blake, master of empires, admitted to himself that control was not in his hands anymore. It belonged to a girl the world had forgotten. A ghost in the system who had somehow found her way to him. Morning did not begin with the usual shrill urgency of alarms, notifications, and back-to-back calls. For Richard Blake, the day began with something stranger, softer, A faint humming floated down the marble hallway of his penthouse, off-key, but cheerful. Childlike yet steady, he followed the sound to the kitchen and paused in the doorway. Lacey stood on tiptoe at the counter, her small hands wrapped around an orange, struggling to roll it against the surface the way she must have once seen her mother do. His assistant had left a juicer, and though she barely had the strength to press the fruit, she was determined, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. The oversized pajamas bunched around her wrists, making her look smaller, but the hum never stopped. Richard stood watching, silent, something tugging inside him he couldn't quite name. His mornings had always been a sprint into battle, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, mind already 3 steps ahead. Yet here he was, frozen, listening to the rhythm of a little girl trying to make orange juice. When she noticed him, she didn't startle. She simply looked up and said, "It's harder than it looks." He almost laughed, a sound he hadn't felt in his chest for months. "Let me," he offered, stepping forward. She shook her head fiercely, braids swaying. "No, I want to try." So he let her, and when she finally managed a single half glass of juice, she slid it toward him with a pride that didn't belong to the act itself, but to the chance of giving something back. Breakfast stretched longer than Richard realized. Pancakes disappeared, eggs cooled. He watched as she studied the skyline through the massive windows, curiosity lighting her eyes. At one point, she asked, "Why is money so important if it doesn't make people happy?" The question punched through him. In boardrooms, he answered the unanswerable every day. But this pierced too deep. He stalled, fingers tightening around his coffee mug. Finally, he said, "Because most people don't know what to do without it." She tilted her head, unsatisfied but unwilling to argue. She returned to her fruit, and the silence that followed was heavier than any negotiation he'd ever sat through. That day, Richard tried to work from his office. He set himself behind the glass door, as he always did, dictating the mails, reviewing financials, outlining next steps for the acquisition. But his attention fractured. The girl drifted in and out, sometimes barefoot, sometimes curled up with the book he'd had delivered that morning. She would pause at the edge of the room, as if checking to see if he was still there, then retreat without a word. He realized he was listening for those small footsteps, for the sound of pages turning, as if they anchored him more than his empire ever had died by evening. He found himself doing something utterly foreign. He left work unfinished. The contracts still lay spread across his desk, red flag clauses waiting for decisions. Yet instead of staying hunched over them until dawn, he walked with Lacey through the streets of the city. They stopped at a bookstore, where she wandered between shelves, fingers trailing over spines as though each volume contained a secret treasure. He bought her 3 without asking. Then they sat on a bench outside the park, eating ice cream as traffic roared and neon flickered around them. Between licks of strawberry swirl, she said, "I don't know why you're helping me. Most people don't even look at me when I talk." Richard studied her, struck by the simplicity of the truth she had spoken. He thought of the waiters at the restaurant, the executives at the bar, the concierge in the lobby. Each of them had turned away, had trained their eyes not to see. Yet he had seen, and now nothing could undo that choice. "Because you're the first person who's helped me in a long time," he said quietly, "and because you shouldn't have to do it alone anymore." Her eyes flicked up to him, searching, and for the briefest moment, the mask of composure she wore cracked. Vulnerability leaked through, raw and unguarded, before she bent back to her ice cream. That night, the fragile balance tipped again. He woke in the early hours to a sound, soft gasps muffled through walls. He followed it to the guest bathroom, where he found her on the cold tile floor, hugging her knees. Trying to hide tears, she tried to smile when he entered. Just a bad dream, but the way her voice shook betrayed her. She spoke haltingly of the last shelter she'd been in, the cramped bunks, the shouting at night, the constant fear of being moved, of disappearing into yet another strange place where no one cared. She spoke of her mother, how she used to sing lullabies in Spanish, how she taught her words because words were stronger than walls. Her voice broke when she said, but words didn't keep her alive. Richard had no answer, no polished line to cover the hollow in her truth. He only sat beside her on the cold floor, silent, steady, until her shoulders stopped shaking. Then he said the only thing he could, "I'm not going anywhere. Not tomorrow. Not next week. I promise you that." She didn't respond, but she leaned against him, and in that quiet contact, something unspoken bound them. When she finally fell asleep again, Richard returned to his office, but not to contracts. This time, he opened his laptop and typed a new search, how to become a legal guardian. It felt reckless, absurd, terrifying, but it also felt like the first decision in years that had nothing to do with shareholders, nothing to do with markets. It had everything to do with a girl who hummed while she squeezed oranges, who read Spanish contracts like puzzles, who had cracked open his fortress of solitude with nothing more than hunger and honesty. And as the city lights flickered against the glass walls of his penthouse, Richard Blake, man who once measured worth only in numbers, realized his empire was shifting. Control wasn't in quarterly reports or flawless contracts anymore. It was in a promise whispered to a child who had trusted him against all odds. It was terrifying, and it was the most powerful thing he had ever felt. The boardroom was a theater of power, paneled in walnut and trimmed in glass, suspended high above Manhattan's skyline. Every chair was filled with executives who measured their words in billions, and their time in seconds. The hum of tension was palpable, a vibration running beneath the polished table. Beneath the city itself, Richard Blake sat at the head of the table, as he always had, but something in his posture was different. He didn't lean forward with the usual sharp authority. He sat straighter, quieter, as though the room itself no longer commanded him the way it used to. His eyes were on a stack of documents in front of him, contracts, revised and dissected. The very documents that could decide the fate of his empire. "Mr. Blake," one of the attorneys said, sliding a highlighted page forward, "this is the latest draft. We've confirmed the Spanish clauses have been unusual, but I'll admit, we nearly missed the worst of it." His voice dipped with unease. "Hidden phrasing, buried conditions. Without correction, you have signed away controlling interest in our Spanish assets. Possibly the entire expansion." A murmur rippled through the room. Executives shifted in their chairs, uneasy. Some darted looks at Richard as though expecting an explosion, but Richard didn't move. He kept his expression unreadable, though his chest tightened with the knowledge of how close he'd come to disaster. A barefoot child in a midtown restaurant had stopped him from walking into ruin. Who caught it? Another board member demanded. The attorney hesitated. "It wasn't us." The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Richard's gaze swept the room. These were men and women who prided themselves on control, precision, power. None of them knew the truth that the empire they were protecting had been salvaged by a little girl who should not even exist in their world. "I caught it," Richard said finally, his voice even. Authoritative. It wasn't a lie. Not exactly. He had seen it through Lacey's eyes, through her small finger tracing the traps. But the truth was a secret he wasn't ready to share. Not yet. The meeting carried on, but unease lingered. Rivals across the ocean had set a trap, and he had nearly fallen headfirst into it. That realization churned in him, twisting tighter with every word spoken around the table. When the meeting ended, Richard stepped into the hallway. The glass doors closed behind him, sealing the murmurs away. And there she was, Lacey, sitting on a sleek leather bench, her small legs swinging above the polished floor. A children's book sat open in her lap, though her eyes weren't on the page. She looked up the instant she saw him, her face softening in recognition. Something inside him unclenched. He walked toward her, and for the first time in his career, the weight of the empire on his shoulders felt less important than the tiny presence, waiting patiently for him. "Did it work?" she asked, tilting her head. "It worked," Richard said, crouching down so he was eye level with her. "You saved me." The words escaped before he could stop them. He hadn't said those words to anyone in decades. Saved him. Not his company. Not his reputation. Him. Her lips curved into a shy, lopsided smile. "Good." She turned the page of her book, as if saving a CEO was as ordinary as asking for food. Richard studied her, realizing the truth with a clarity that stunned him. This wasn't just gratitude. It wasn't even debt. It was something far more dangerous, far more binding. Trust. She trusted him, and he had already begun to trust her. That night, the stakes sharpened. Calls came in from Europe, rivals angry, accusing, scrambling to regain ground. Richard let them rant. For the first time in years, their voices didn't shake him. His empire had been preserved not by contracts or counsel, but by a girl who hummed in his kitchen while making orange juice. But shadows remained. The intelligence contact he'd hired called with upgrades. "She's not in the system, Richard. Not properly. There are fragments, yes, shelter logs, a hospital admission, but nothing consistent. It's like someone erased her, or forgot her," Richard murmured, Same thing, the voice said. The words chilled him more than any hostile takeover ever had. Forgotten children disappeared. Forgotten children didn't survive. And yet here she was, alive, bright, carving her place into his world with every passing day. Later, after Lacey had fallen asleep clutching the stuffed bear, Richard sat alone in the dark, the city lights flickering across the windows. His mind replayed the boardroom scene, the hushed shock when the hidden clauses had been revealed. He saw again the image of her waiting in the hallway, so small against the marble and glass, yet holding more weight than all the executives combined. For years, he had defined power as control of companies, of people, of outcomes. But tonight, staring into the shadows, he realized power had shifted. It wasn't in contracts or signatures. It was in the promise he made to a child who had nothing but had given him everything. And for the first time, Richard Blake was terrified not of losing his empire, but of losing her. The courtroom smelled faintly of polish and old wood, a place built to strip lives down into facts and laws. Richard Blake had walked into countless boardrooms, faced hostile takeovers, and stared down men twice as ruthless as himself. But as he sat at the long oak table, his heart pounded harder than it ever had across the negotiation dot. At his side sat Lacey, her legs barely touching the floor, a stuffed bear tucked tight in her arms. She wore the dress he'd bought her, pale blue with a bow at the waist. It made her look younger, more fragile, as though the world needed a reminder she was still a child. Richard's attorney, Clara Sharp, calm, a woman with fire in her voice, leaned in and whispered, "Remember, you don't need to prove you're perfect, just that you're the one who won't fail her." Richard nodded, but inside, he felt the weight of a different truth. He had already failed her once. If fate hadn't led her to that restaurant, if she hadn't been brave enough to speak, his empire would have collapsed and she would still be wandering invisible streets. The judge, a woman with steel gray hair and an expression honed by decades of hearing lies, called the session to order. Opposite Richard sat representatives from child services, armed with reports and clipped voices. They painted a picture of danger, a billionaire CEO, too busy, too cold, unfit to raise a child. Mr. Blake's life is constructed around profit margins and quarterly reports, one attorney said. He is not equipped to provide stability, warmth, or long-term care. Richard's chest tightened, not because the words cut deep, but because once, not long ago, they were true. Then Clara rose. She didn't speak of wealth or power. She spoke of nights when Lacey cried from nightmares, and Richard sat silently beside her until she slept again. She spoke of mornings filled with orange juice and humming, of a man who had postponed million-dollar meetings to watch a child eat pancakes. "This isn't about the life he had before," Clara said, voice ringing across the chamber. "It's about the life he has now and the one he refuses to let her lose." The judge turned to Lacey. "Would you like to say something, child?" The courtroom went utterly still. Lacey slid off her chair, walked to the center, her small shoes clicking softly against the floor. She clutched the bear, but lifted her chin, her blue eyes steady. "He didn't just give me food," she said, her voice small but carrying. "He gave me home. He listens when I talk. He tells me I'm safe. And he didn't make me leave, even when I thought he would." "I think that means family." A silence followed, heavy with the undeniable truth of a child's voice. Richard gripped the table, forcing himself not to crumble under the weight of it. But then, just as hope flickered, the shocking blow came. Child Services produced a Documentan anonymous report questioning Richard's motives. It suggested he had found Lacey in connection with a Spanish acquisition deal, implying she had been used to gain leverage, that he was exploiting her knowledge. Murmurs rippled through the room. Richard's jaw clenched. His eyes narrowed. "Who submitted this?" Claire demanded. The judge frowned, flipping the document. "Anonymous, but the evidence provided is detailed." Richard's mind raced. Only a handful of people knew the timing of Lacey's appearance, knew the chaos of the missing translator. And then it hit him like ice in his veins. The translator, the one who had vanished hours before the deal collapsed. Clara turned, whispering, "If this sticks, they'll strip guardianship from you immediately." Richard stood. "Your Honor, may I speak?" The judge gestured reluctantly. He faced the courtroom, voice harder than steel. "That report isn't from a concerned citizen. It's sabotage. My translator disappeared hours before the deal. Now I find this an accusation designed to erase the child who saved my company. No, this isn't about whether I can raise her. It's about rivals who couldn't destroy me through contracts trying to destroy me through her. His voice cracked on the last word, and the truth of it rang louder than any argument. The judge studied him, then studied Lacey, who stood gripping her bear, staring at him with wide, unwavering eyes. The courtroom doors burst open. Clara's assistant rushed in, a file clutched in her hands. "We found something," she gasped. "The translator was paid by your rivals in Madrid. The money trail is clear. They orchestrated everything. The missing translator, the hidden clauses, even this anonymous report." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge raised her gavel sharply for silence. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of betrayal crashing down and then the relief. It wasn't paranoia. He hadn't imagined the shadows circling him. And Lacey hadn't just saved him once. She'd saved him twice, first from the trap in the contract, and now, by being the very reason he fought harder than he ever had. The judge's voice cut through the air. "Mr. Blake, this court rules in your favor. You are granted temporary guardianship with conditions to transition into permanence. This child will remain with you," Lacey gasped softly, clutching her bear tighter. Richard lowered himself to one knee, arms open, and she rushed into them without hesitation. The courtroom blurred around him, lawyers, judges, whispers. None of it mattered. "You didn't just save my business, Lacey," he whispered against her hair. "You saved me," and for the first time in his adult life, Richard Blake, master of empires, realized he was no longer building a kingdom of glass and steel. He was building something far stronger, a family.